Store employee gets fired over a mistake, but the owner's daughter steps in to change his life. See what happened. Subscribe so you don't miss our exciting stories. Thomas Miller stood frozen in the middle of Princeton's largest department store, his hands trembling as he held the dismissal notice. After 15 years of dedicated service at Morrison's department store, a single mistake had cost him everything. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder than usual, matching the ringing in his ears as he tried to process what was happening. "I'm sorry, Thomas," said Richard Morrison, Jr., the store's current owner, his voice cold and detached. "But $50,000 worth of inventory doesn't just disappear. Someone has to be held accountable." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Mr. Morrison, please. I've dedicated my entire adult life to this store. I've never even taken a sick day. There must be some mistake in the system." "The system doesn't make mistakes. In Thomas, people do." Richard Jr. straightened his designer tie, a gesture that reminded Thomas of the old days when Richard Morrison Sr. used to run the store. The father had been a different kind of man entirely, fair, compassionate, and understanding. But since his retirement 3 years ago, his son had transformed Morrison's from a family-oriented business into a cold, profit-driven enterprise. "I have a mortgage," Thomas pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter's starting college next fall. Please, just give me a chance to prove." "Security will escort you out." Richard Jr. cut him off, already turning away. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to you." As if on cue, 2 security guards appeared at Thomas's sides. The same guards he'd greeted every morning for years, now avoiding his eyes as they waited to march him out of the building. The humiliation burned deeper than the fear. From across the store floor, through the morning crowd of early shoppers, Sarah Morrison watched the scene unfold. Unlike her brother Richard Jr., she had inherited their father's compassionate nature. At 28, she was the youngest Morrison, and though she held shares in the company, Richard Jr. had systematically pushed her out of any meaningful decision-making role. Sarah's heart clenched as she watched Thomas being escorted toward the exit. She remembered him from her childhood visits to the store, how he'd always saved the best candy from the store's confectionery for her, telling her stories about his own daughter who was just a few years younger than her. Now, seeing him clutching his personal belongings in a small box, his shoulders slumped in defeat, she felt something inside her snap. The security guards had just reached the main entrance with Thomas when Sarah's voice rang out across the store floor. "Wait!" Heads turned as she strode purposefully through the aisles, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Richard Jr. emerged from his office, his face darkening at the sight of his sister's intervention. "Sarah," he warned, "this is a business matter. It doesn't concern you." But Sarah had already reached Thomas and the guards. "Mr. Miller," she said, loud enough for nearby customers to hear, "before you leave, I'd like to review your case personally. As a member of the Morrison family and a major shareholder, I believe I have that right." She turned to her brother, her eyes challenging him to object. Richard Jr.'s jaw clenched, but he was too aware of the watching customers to make a scene. "Fine," he spat. "Use my office. You have 15 minutes. As Sarah led Thomas back through the store, whispers followed them. She could feel her brother's glare boring into her back, but she didn't care. Something about this situation felt wrong, and she was determined to uncover the truth. In the office, Thomas sank into a chair, looking lost and broken. Sarah sat across from him, pushing aside her brother's expensive nameplate to create space for Thomas's personnel file, which she'd grabbed from HR on her way up. "Tell me everything," she said softly. "From the beginning." Thomas took a shaky breath. 3 days ago, I was doing the monthly inventory check in the electronics department. Everything was normal until I got to the high-end cameras and laptops. According to the system, we should have had 53 units worth about $50,000, but physically, there were only 7 units on the floor and none in the stockroom. Sarah frowned. "And you reported this immediately?" "Of course," Thomas nodded. "I followed protocol exactly. I notified my supervisor, filed the discrepancy report, and requested security footage review. But yesterday, Mr. Morrison Jr. called me in and accused me of falsifying inventory records to cover up theft. Something didn't add up. Sarah began flipping through the file, scanning dates and numbers. The missing inventory, when was it logged into the system? 2 weeks ago, according to the records. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she spotted a pattern. And who signed for the delivery? Thomas leaned forward to look at the document she was pointing to. That's strange, he muttered. That's not my signature, though it's listed under my employee number. I wasn't even working that day. It was my daughter's birthday. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as pieces began falling into place. She pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to an old friend who worked in IT. Within minutes, she received a response that made her blood run cold. "Mr. Miller," she said carefully, "I think I know what happened here, but I need you to trust me and give me a little time. Can you do that?" Thomas looked at her with desperate hope in his eyes. "Miss Morrison, you're the only one who's even listened to me. Of course I trust you." Sarah stood up, her mind racing with possibilities and plans. "Go home for now. I promise I'll contact you within 48 hours. And Mr. Miller," she met his eyes firmly, "don't cash that final paycheck when it arrives." After Thomas left, Sarah sat alone in her brother's office, staring at the evidence she'd gathered. She knew she was about to start a war within her family, but for the first time in years, she felt alive with purpose. Someone had set Thomas up to take the fall for something much bigger, and she was going to find out why. What she didn't know was that her investigation would uncover secrets that would shake Morrison's department store to its very foundation and force her to confront truths about her own family that she never wanted to face. That evening, Sarah sat in her downtown apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets and internal documents she'd quietly collected before leaving the store. Her laptop screen cast a pale blue glow across her face as she cross-referenced delivery dates, employee schedules, and inventory records. The more she dug, the more alarming the pattern became. "This can't be a coincidence," she muttered, marking another suspicious transaction. Over the past 6 months, there had been 12 separate instances of high-value electronics appearing in the system but never making it to the sales floor. Each time, the paperwork had been signed using the employee numbers of staff members who weren't actually working those days. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen, her friend in IT who'd helped her earlier. "You need to see this. Can you meet now?" 20 minutes later, Sarah sat in a quiet corner of a local diner, watching Marcus pull up security footage on his tablet. "Look at this," he said, his voice low. "These are from the loading dock 2 weeks ago, the night the missing electronics were supposedly delivered." The grainy footage showed the loading dock at 11:45 p.m., well after normal delivery hours. A truck without company markings backed up to the dock, and 3 men quickly unloaded several pallets. One of them moved with a familiar swagger that made Sarah's heart sink. "That's Jason Fuller," she whispered. "Richard's new operations manager." Marcus nodded grimly. "Watch what happens next." The footage showed Fuller directing the unloading, but instead of taking the merchandise to the main stockroom, the men wheeled everything into the small overflow storage area. 20 minutes later, a different truck arrived, and all the pallets were loaded onto it. Fuller could be seen counting out cash to the drivers of both trucks. "He's running a ghost inventory scheme," Sarah realized, her mind racing. They log non-existent merchandise into the system. Then, when the discrepancy is discovered, they blame it on theft and insurance covers the loss. "It gets worse," Marcus said, swiping to another video. "Look who shows up at 1 a.m. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched her brother Richard walk into frame, hand Fuller an envelope, and engage in what appeared to be an intense discussion. "He's in on it," she breathed. "My own brother." "Sarah," Marcus hesitated, "there's something else you should know. I did some digging into Fuller's background. Before Richard hired him, he worked at 3 other retail chains. Each one reported major inventory losses before he left, and each time a lower-level employee was blamed and fired." Sarah thought of Thomas Miller, of his daughter's college dreams now in jeopardy, and felt anger burning in her chest. "How many others?" she demanded. "How many other employees has my brother fired to cover this up?" Marcus pulled up a spreadsheet. "In the past 6 months, 7, all long-term employees with clean records, all accused of theft or fraud based on discrepancies in Fuller's departments." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need copies of everything, and I need you to keep digging. There has to be a money trail." "Sarah," Marcus caught her arm, his expression worried. "Be careful. This isn't just about inventory fraud anymore. The amount of money involved, this could be serious organized crime. And if your brother's involved, then he needs to be stopped," Sarah finished firmly. "These are people's lives they're destroying, families, children's futures. I won't let them get away with it." The next morning, Sarah arrived at Morrison's earlier than usual. She needed to move carefully now that she knew what she was dealing with. Her first stop was Human Resources, where she used her family name to gain access to the files of all recently terminated employees. As she read through case after case, her hands began to shake with rage. The pattern was identical each time. A dedicated employee discovers inventory discrepancies, reports them following proper procedure, and is subsequently accused of theft or fraud. Each termination signed off by her brother personally. She was so absorbed in the files that she didn't hear the door open behind her. Looking for something specific, Sarah whirled around to find Jason Fuller leaning against the doorframe, his expression neutral, but his eyes cold. She forced herself to remain calm, remembering the security footage from the previous night. "Just reviewing some personnel matters," she said smoothly, closing the file in front of her. "Family privilege." Fuller stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You know, your brother mentioned you might start poking around after that scene with Miller yesterday. He said you always had a soft spot for the staff. Is that what he called it?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Caring about people who've given years of their lives to this company? Business is business, Miss Morrison. Sometimes hard decisions have to be made." He moved closer, his presence deliberately intimidating. "Your father understood that. In the end, that's why he stepped down when he did." Something in his tone made Sarah's blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" Fuller smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Why don't you ask Richard about your father's retirement package? I'm sure he'd love to have that conversation with his dear sister." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it quickly. "Emergency meeting called by our main conference room. Now, shall we?" Fuller gestured to the door with exaggerated courtesy. Sarah's mind raced as she walked toward the conference room. Fuller's comment about her father's retirement hadn't been casual. It was a warning, but it had also been a mistake. He'd just confirmed there was even more to this story than she'd discovered. The conference room was already full when she arrived. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face stormy. The board members filled most seats, with Fuller taking his place at Richard's right hand. Sarah felt their eyes on her as she sat down. Some curious, some concerned, others hostile. "Now that we're all here," Richard began, his voice tight with controlled anger, "we need to address a situation that's developed. It seems some members of the Morrison family," his eyes locked onto Sarah, "have been conducting unauthorized investigations into company operations." Sarah sat up straighter, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Funny, I was just about to bring up some concerns about our operations myself." She reached for her bag, where she kept copies of everything Marcus had given her. But before she could continue, Richard slid a document across the table toward her. "Before you say another word, dear sister, you might want to read this." Sarah picked up the paper, and as she read, she felt the blood drain from her face. It was a copy of the company's founding articles, with one section highlighted. "Any shareholder found to be acting against the company's interests can be subject to immediate divestment of their shares at a value to be determined by the current CEO." Richard's smile was cold as ice. "So, Sarah, Would you like to reconsider whatever it is you think you've discovered? Sarah looked around the table, at the faces of people who'd known her since childhood, who'd worked with her father for decades. Some couldn't meet her eyes. Others looked resigned. A few seemed almost sympathetic, but as she caught sight of their father's portrait hanging on the wall, something clicked into place. Fuller's words about her father's retirement echoed in her mind, and suddenly she knew exactly what she had to do. She stood up slowly, gathering her things. "You're right, Richard. I do need to reconsider my next move very carefully." She walked to the door, then paused. "Oh, and brother, give me 48 hours. I think you'll find what I have to say very interesting." As she walked out of Morrison's that morning, Sarah pulled out her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Marcus. "I need everything you can find about my father's retirement, and I mean everything." The second call was to Thomas Miller. "Mr. Miller, meet me at Clayton's Cafe in an hour. I think I know what really happened to that inventory, and I'm going to need your help to prove it." What Sarah didn't know was that her brother was already making calls of his own, calls that would put both her and Thomas in serious danger. The game was no longer just about saving one man's job. It had become a race to expose the truth before those who wanted it buried could stop her. Clayton's Cafe was nearly empty when Thomas Miller arrived. He found Sarah at a corner booth, her laptop open and papers spread across the table. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much, but her expression was focused and determined. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Miller," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What I'm about to tell you might sound crazy, but I need you to hear me out." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah laid out everything she'd discovered: the fake deliveries, the ghost inventory scheme, and Jason Fuller's history at other stores. Thomas listened intently, his face growing darker with each revelation. "But there's more," Sarah continued, lowering her voice. "Something happened 3 years ago when my father retired, something that never made sense until now." She pulled out an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Morrison's department store CEO steps down unexpectedly." The photo showed her father at the press conference, looking tired and somehow defeated, so different from the confident man she'd known her whole life. "My father loved this store," Sarah said, her voice tight with emotion. "He used to say it wasn't just a business, it was a family. He knew every employee's name, their children's names. He would never have abandoned it without a reason." Thomas nodded slowly. "I remember that day. It was like a light went out in the store. None of us could understand why he left so suddenly." "Look at this," Sarah said, pulling up financial records on her laptop. 3 months before his retirement, the store started showing major losses in the electronics department. "Sound familiar?" "Fuller," Thomas breathed, "but he wasn't working here then." "No, but guess who brought him in as a consultant to help address the losses? My brother Richard." Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up more documents. "And look at this. 2 weeks after my father retired, all those losses were mysteriously resolved, written off as accounting errors." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes widening as he processed the implications. "They forced him out? Your own brother forced your father out of his company?" "I think they gave him a choice," Sarah said grimly. "Step down quietly, or they'd destroy the store's reputation with fraud allegations. My father would have done anything to protect the Morrison name, to protect the employees who depended on him." A sudden commotion at the cafe's entrance made them both look up. 2 large men in dark suits had walked in, scanning the room with obvious purpose. "Back door," Sarah whispered, quickly gathering her papers. "Now!" They slipped out through the kitchen, just as the men spotted their table. Outside, Sarah led Thomas through a maze of alleyways until they were sure they weren't being followed. "What was that?" Thomas asked, breathing heavily. "Who were those men?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But after this morning's board meeting, I'm not taking any chances. We need somewhere safe to work, somewhere they won't think to look." Thomas hesitated for a moment, then said, "I might know a place." An hour later, they sat in the basement of St. Michael's Church, where Thomas had volunteered for years. Father James, an old friend, had given them use of the church's office after hearing a carefully edited version of their situation. Sarah was going through her father's old emails, which Marcus had managed to recover, when she suddenly sat up straight. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Look at this." The email was dated 3 days before her father's retirement announcement. It was from Richard to Jason Fuller, accidentally copied to their father's email. "Plan in place. Once the old man's gone, we can expand the operation to all stores. Estimated annual profit, $200 per location. Contacts in place for distribution. Meeting tonight to finalize details." Distribution, Thomas frowned. "What distribution?" Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled up more files. "The missing electronics, they're not just disappearing, they're being sold. The ghost inventory scheme isn't just about insurance fraud. It's covering up a massive theft and resale operation." She turned to Thomas, her face pale. "And my brother's not just allowing it to happen. He's running it." Before Thomas could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Urgent. Found something about your father. Meeting at his house now. He wants to talk." Sarah stared at the message in shock. She hadn't spoken to her father since his retirement. He'd withdrawn from everyone, moved to a small house outside the city, refused most visitors. If he was willing to talk now— "I have to go," she said, standing up. "My father—" "You can't go alone," Thomas interrupted. "Not after what happened at the cafe. I'm coming with you." Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. They'd become partners in this investigation, and something told her they'd need each other for what was coming next. The drive to her father's house took 40 minutes, during which Sarah filled Thomas in on more details about her father, how he'd built Morrison's from a single store into a regional chain, how he'd always put employees first, how the light had seemed to go out of him in those final months before his retirement. As they pulled up to the modest house where Richard Morrison Sr. now lived, Sarah felt her heart pounding. A familiar car was parked in the driveway. Marcus had already arrived. But something felt wrong. The front door was slightly ajar. "Wait here," Sarah told Thomas, but he was already getting out of the car with her. They approached the house cautiously. Sarah called out, "Dad! Marcus! It's Sarah!" No response. They found Marcus in the study, unconscious but breathing, a nasty bump on his head. And on the desk, a laptop was open to a video file, paused on an image that made Sarah's blood run cold. It showed her father, tied to a chair, looking directly into the camera. The timestamp was from 2 hours ago. A text message popped up on Sarah's phone, unknown number, "Ready to reconsider your investigation. Little sister? You have until midnight to sign over your shares and forget everything you've seen, or Dad pays the price for your curiosity." Thomas caught Sarah as her knees buckled. "We have to call the police," he said. "No." Sarah gripped his arm. "You don't know my brother. He'll have contingencies. If we involve the police—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Then what do we do?" Sarah stood up straight, her mind racing. "We have 6 hours until midnight. And I think I know where they're keeping him. But we're going to need help, and not just from Marcus." She pulled out her phone and started dialing. "Remember those other employees who were fired? I think it's time for a reunion. My brother and Fuller aren't the only ones who can put together a team." As she made her calls, Sarah glanced at the video of her father again. She would save him, expose the truth, and take back Morrison's, not just for her family, but for every employee who'd ever been wronged by her brother's greed. What she didn't know was that Richard had one more card to play, one that would force her to make an impossible choice before the night was over. Time was running out. Sarah sat in Thomas's living room, surrounded by 5 former Morrison's employees who had answered her urgent call. Each had been fired under suspicious circumstances over the past year, and each had their own story of injustice at the hands of Richard Jr. and Jason Fuller. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know it's asking a lot, but my father's life depends on what we do in the next few hours." Linda Chen, a former inventory manager with 20 years of experience, spoke first. After what they did to all of us, you don't have to ask twice. Marcus had recovered enough to join them, though he still nursed a headache. His laptop was open, displaying blueprints of an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building is owned by a shell company, he explained, but I traced it back through 6 different corporations, all leading to a holding company where Jason Fuller is listed as a director. That's got to be where they're keeping Mr. Morrison Sr., Thomas said, studying the layout. These loading docks match the ones from the security footage where we saw the stolen electronics being moved. David Parker, who had worked security at Morrison's for 12 years before being fired, pointed to several spots on the blueprint. Main entrance here, emergency exits here and here. If they've got guards, these are the likely patrol routes. Sarah nodded, taking it all in. What about cameras? Already on it, Marcus said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Their security system is good, but not good enough. I can loop their external cameras for 7 minutes. That's our window to get inside. James Rodriguez, former head of maintenance, spread out a more detailed schematic of the building's interior. There's a utility tunnel that runs under the east side. Maintenance access only. I worked on a similar building last year. These old warehouses all use the same design. That tunnel will lead us straight to the main storage area. The final member of their group, Karen Foster, who had been Richard Sr.'s executive assistant for 15 years before Richard Jr. fired her, held up her phone. I still have contacts inside Morrison's corporate office. Richard just called an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. He's planning to announce his father's sudden decision to sell his remaining shares in the company. Sarah checked her watch. 8:45 p.m., just over 3 hours until the midnight deadline. Then we move now. Everyone knows their part? They nodded grimly. Years of working together had forged a trust between these people that even Richard's betrayals couldn't break. Now, that trust might save Richard Sr.'s life. As they gathered their equipment, radios, flashlights, tools James had brought from his new maintenance job, Sarah pulled Thomas aside. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You've already risked enough. Your daughter is exactly why I have to do this," Thomas interrupted. "What kind of example would I be setting if I walked away now? Besides," he managed a small smile, "your father gave me a chance 15 years ago when no one else would. It's time to return the favor." Sarah felt tears threatening, but forced them back. There would be time for emotions later. Now, they needed to focus. The warehouse loomed dark and imposing against the night sky. From their vantage point across the street, they could see 2 guards patrolling the perimeter. A single light burned in an upper office window. "That's where they'll be keeping him," David said. "Best visibility of the surrounding area. Easy to defend. Separate power supply for the elevator." "Everyone check your radios," Sarah whispered. "Channel 3, secure band. Marcus, cameras looping in 3, 2, 1. Now, 7 minutes, people. Make them count." They moved like shadows across the parking lot. James led them to a rusted maintenance door that yielded quickly to his expertise with a lockpick. As they descended into the utility tunnel, Sarah's phone buzzed. Another message from her brother. 4 hours left, Sarah. Tick-tock. She switched off the phone. Richard's overconfidence had always been his weakness. He would never expect her to attempt a rescue, which gave them their only advantage. The tunnel was narrow and damp, their flashlight beams creating eerie shadows on the concrete walls. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, James held up his hand for them to stop. "Access panel above us," he whispered. "Should come up right behind some storage shelves." Linda and Karen stationed themselves at the tunnel entrance as lookouts. The others helped James carefully remove the panel, then boosted each other up into the warehouse. The storage area was massive, filled with rows of shelves reaching to the ceiling. And there, in the center of the space, were dozens of pallets loaded with electronics. The missing inventory from Morrison's, and probably other stores as well. "Evidence," Sarah breathed, quickly snapping photos with her phone. A sudden noise from above made them freeze. Footsteps moving across the upper floor. 2 more guards just entered the building, Linda's voice crackled through their radios, looking like a shift change. Sarah gestured for the others to take their positions. According to their plan, David and James would create a diversion on the ground floor while Sarah, Thomas, and Marcus made their way upstairs. They found the service stairwell exactly where James had said it would be. As they reached the second floor, they heard raised voices coming from the office with the light. "Don't care what it takes," Richard's voice angry and slightly panicked. "Find her! She has to be planning something." "Calm down," Fuller's smoother tones replied. "Even if she tries anything, she'll never—" A tremendous crash from below cut him off, followed by alarmed shouts from the guards. David and James had started their diversion. "What the hell was that?" Richard demanded. "Stay with him," Fuller ordered someone, presumably another guard. "I'll handle this." Sarah counted to 10 after hearing Fuller's footsteps fade, then nodded to Thomas and Marcus. They burst through the office door, catching the remaining guard completely by surprise. David's security training had paid off. They had him subdued and zip-tied in seconds. And there, bound to a chair but very much alive, was Richard Morrison Sr. "Dad!" Sarah rushed to him, her hands shaking as she worked on his restraints. "Sarah!" His voice was hoarse but strong. "What are you doing here? It's not safe." "Later!" She cut him off as Thomas helped him to his feet. "Right now we're getting you out of here." But they'd only taken 2 steps toward the door when slow applause made them all spin around. Richard Jr. stood in the doorway, a gun trained steadily on their group. "I have to admit, sister dear, I didn't think you had it in you, breaking and entering, converting my own employees against me. I'm almost impressed." "It's over, Richard," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have evidence of everything, the fraud, the theft, all of it." "Evidence?" Richard laughed. "You mean those photos you just took downstairs? Tisk, tisk, Sarah. Check your phone." Sarah pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. The photo app was empty. Every picture she'd taken was gone. "Amazing what you can do with the right technology," Richard smirked. "Did you really think we wouldn't have signal jammers in a warehouse full of stolen electronics? Everything you sent, every picture you took, it all came straight to me." A commotion from behind him drew their attention. Fuller appeared, dragging Marcus with him. Blood trickled from a cut on Marcus's forehead. "Found this one trying to access our system from a laptop in the stairwell," Fuller reported. "Don't worry, we took care of his little hacking attempt too." Sarah's mind raced. The plan was falling apart. Where were the others? As if reading her thoughts, Richard's smile widened. "Your little team of disgruntled ex-employees, currently enjoying a reunion with local law enforcement. Anonymous tip about a break-in. Very unfortunate. You won't get away with this." Thomas spoke up, his voice firm despite the gun pointed at them. "Too many people know the truth now." "Know what truth?" Richard countered. "That a group of fired employees, led by my unstable sister, broke into a private warehouse and attacked innocent security guards. That they tried to kidnap our poor father, who's been recovering from a stress-induced breakdown. The press will love it." "You're forgetting something, son," Richard Sr. said quietly. "I'm still here, and I'm ready to tell my story." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard Jr.'s face. "A story no one will believe, old man, not after the psychiatric evaluation we have on file from 3 years ago. Remember that? The one that documents your paranoid delusions about corporate conspiracies?" Sarah felt sick. They'd thought of everything, laid their groundwork years in advance. How could they fight against this level of manipulation? But then she noticed something. A tiny red light blinking on Thomas's chest. Her eyes widened as she realized what it was and why he'd insisted on wearing his old Morrison's employee badge holder, even though it no longer held an ID. The recording light was on. Thomas caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Everything since they'd entered the office, every word, every threat, every admission, was being recorded and transmitted. But to where? She just had to keep them talking long enough to find out. "Why, Richard?" she asked, taking a step forward. "The store was successful. Dad was going to hand it over to you anyway. Why do all this?" "Successful?" Richard scoffed. "Making what? A few million a year in profit? Do you have any idea how much we're making now? Every missing shipment, every insurance claim, every resale through our offshore channels, we'll clear 50 million this year alone. At the expense of innocent people's lives, Sarah shot back. People like Thomas, who gave everything to this company. People like Thomas, Richard interrupted, are replaceable. Numbers on a spreadsheet. That was Dad's problem too. Too sentimental, too worried about loyalty and family and all that nonsense. Business isn't about family. It's about profit. And I've turned his precious little department store into a gold mine. A new voice spoke from the doorway. I think we've heard enough, don't you? Everyone turned to see Karen Foster standing there, holding up her phone. Next to her was Captain Michael Hayes of the Princeton Police Department's Corporate Crimes Division. Karen. Fuller took a step toward her but stopped as several armed officers appeared behind her. Did you really think I was just Richard Sr.'s secretary for 15 years? Karen's smile was razor sharp. I've been working with corporate crimes since we first suspected inventory fraud 2 years ago. We just needed evidence directly linking you to the operation. Thank you for finally providing it. Sarah looked at Thomas's badge holder. The recording light was still blinking. It was transmitting to you? Karen nodded. Live feed, straight to the police station. Oh, and those other employees you think were arrested? They're all fine. The real police were on our side from the beginning. As officers moved in to arrest Richard and Fuller, Sarah turned to Thomas. You knew about Karen? Not until tonight, he admitted. She told me when she gave me the recording device. Said she needed someone Richard wouldn't suspect to get close enough. Sarah felt her father's hand on her shoulder. I knew too, he said softly. Karen told me when she discovered what Richard was planning 3 years ago. But we needed more than suspicions. We needed proof. When you started investigating, Karen saw our chance. So you were never really in danger? Sarah asked, relief mixing with lingering anxiety. Oh, the kidnapping was real enough, her father grimaced. They just didn't know they were playing right into our hands. Your rescue attempt gave us the perfect opportunity to get Richard to incriminate himself on record. Sarah watched as her brother was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Fuller had already begun offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. What happens now? She asked, suddenly exhausted. Her father squeezed her shoulder. Now, we rebuild. Together. The right way. As they made their way out of the warehouse, Sarah saw David, James, and Linda waiting by the police cars, all safe and sound. They'd each played their parts perfectly, creating just enough chaos to make Richard believe his plan was working. The night sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. In a few hours, the press would break the story of how a corrupt CEO's scheme was brought down by a dedicated team of former employees. But for now, Sarah was content to stand with her father and Thomas, watching as years of injustice were finally set right. 1 month later, Morrison's department store hummed with renewed energy. The morning sun streamed through the skylights, illuminating the newly renovated main floor where Richard Morrison Sr. stood addressing a crowd of employees, reporters, and loyal customers. Today marks a new chapter in Morrison's history, he announced, his voice strong and clear. Not just a return to our core values, but a step forward in how we protect and value our employees. Sarah stood beside her father, watching the faces in the crowd. Thomas Miller was there, recently reinstated as head of operations, the position Jason Fuller had once held. Beside him sat his daughter, beaming with pride. Her college acceptance letter had arrived last week, along with news of a full scholarship from the newly established Morrison's Employee Family Education Fund. Our strength has always been our people, Richard Sr. continued, and thanks to the courage of those who stood up against corruption, we're implementing new policies to ensure no employee ever faces unjust termination again. The changes were substantial. An independent employee advocacy board had been established, with Thomas and Karen Foster as founding members. Every termination would require thorough review and documentation. The store's profits were strong, legitimately this time, and a profit-sharing program had been introduced for all full-time employees. After the ceremony, Sarah found Thomas organizing the electronics department, where all inventory was now tracked by a state-of-the-art system Marcus had designed. "How does it feel?" she asked. Being back, Thomas smiled, gesturing to the wall behind him where photos of long-term employees hung proudly. "It feels like home again. Your father stopped by earlier, wanted to make sure Jessica had everything she needs for college." "That sounds like him," Sarah laughed. "Though I think he's trying to make up for lost time with everyone." Richard Jr. and Jason Fuller had both pleaded guilty to multiple charges of fraud and conspiracy. The investigation had uncovered similar schemes at other retail chains, leading to a broader industry cleanup. But more importantly, every employee who had been wrongfully terminated under their leadership had been offered reinstatement with back pay. As Sarah walked through the store, she saw Linda Chen training new inventory staff, James Rodriguez supervising improvements to the building's infrastructure, and David Parker implementing enhanced security measures that protected both merchandise and employees' rights. The store's motto, "More than a store, we're family," had been reinstated above the main entrance, but now it wasn't just a slogan, it was a proven commitment, tested by fire and strengthened by the loyalty of those who had fought to protect it. That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave for the day, she found her father standing in his old office, now shared between them as co-CEOs. "Having any regrets?" she asked. Richard Sr. shook his head, smiling. "Only that it took something this dramatic to remind us what matters most. But looking at everything you've helped build here," he placed a hand on her shoulder, "I couldn't be prouder." The sun was setting over Princeton as they left the store together, its last rays catching the Morrison sign that now shone as a beacon of integrity in the retail world. Proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from standing firm with those who share our values. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Would you have risked everything to uncover the truth and save not just your father, but all those innocent employees? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And here's another question to think about. Do you believe Richard Jr. could have been redeemed? Or do some actions go beyond forgiveness? Let us know what you think. If this story of loyalty, courage, and justice touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And speaking of powerful stories, you won't want to miss what's coming up next. On your screen now, you'll see The Millionaire's Test, a gripping tale about a wealthy businessman who accepts a bet to marry a plus-sized woman who challenges all his standards. What starts as a game of power and control soon takes an unexpected turn that will change both their lives forever. Click now to discover how this story of true love and transformation unfolds.